Ladies, gentlemen, and colleagues, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this opening session of the Idea of India conclave to consider the economy 1 year from the time that Narendra Modi assumed office as Prime Minister. The economy in India has been in crisis for quite some time. There are its short-term crises, which are about persistent inflation, about current account deficits, about macroeconomic instabilities. There are its persistent crises visible for a long time. Persistent poverty, rising inequality, and simply insufficient employment creation that is described as jobless growth. And there are its quiet crises that have persisted for long but are not so visible. A deep crisis in agriculture, a deep crisis in infrastructure, a deep crisis in education. Let me invite Professor Prabhat Patnaik.
Thank you, Deepak. Good morning. Before I talk about the 1 year of the current government, I'd like to locate the existing state of the economy and the debate about the economic policy in a somewhat wider context. Whenever you have a problem of crisis or stagnation, you always come across the following argument. The crisis is because there is not enough investment in the economy. If therefore investment could be stimulated, we will come out of the crisis. In an economy like ours, investment can be stimulated if you provide sufficient incentives to the capitalists, if you make it worth their while to invest, if you remove restrictions from them, if their animal spirits are boosted. Therefore, the panacea for a crisis is supposed to consist in actually providing greater transfers to the capitalists, removing so-called hurdles in their path, and making life generally easier for them by making it possible for them to take over land if they want to make investment, by making it possible for them to engage in free hire and fire of workers, and so on. All these are basically ways of boosting the class power of capital. And consequently, the capitalist solution to the capitalist crisis is always presented as lying in boosting the class power of capital. Now this, however, never actually resolved any crisis, because the capitalists don't undertake investment if only it is the case that restrictions are removed or more budgetary transfers are given to them. They just pocket the transfers. They boost investment or they raise investment only when they see symptoms of a revival of the economy, only when demand is rising, only when their orders are increasing, only when it is the case that their level of capacity utilization is rising, and so on. Therefore, if you have simply increase in the class power of capital, that itself does not resolve any crisis. On the contrary, since every such transfer of income from the working population to the capitalist actually reduces the size of the home market, precisely because of the fact that at the margin, a rupee given to a worker would be spent, while at the margin, a rupee given to a capitalist, half of it would probably be spent, the other half held over. You'll find that there will be a net shrinkage of demand, and consequently, every such increase in the class power of capital, instead of actually resolving the crisis, worsens it. And when it worsens the crisis, the argument becomes that further increase the class power of capital, because that is the solution to the crisis. Therefore, there is a very vicious dialectic in which an economy like ours can get into in a period in which there is a certain crisis, and this dialectic, of course, gets played out through the interventions of the state, and if the state is in charge of political formations which actually subscribe to this kind of a belief, subscribe to this kind of dialectic, then corporate interests use these political formations. Now the BJP and NDA are in fact archetypically such a political formation because of the fact that they really do not have much of an internal opposition to a pro-capitalist policy, the way you can see, for instance, in Congress and other bourgeois political parties, there will be some kind of so-called populism. BJP doesn't really have much of populism. It is, certainly way before it came to power, a complete pro-corporate party. Its coming to power, to my mind, is in fact an alliance between communal fascism on the one hand and corporate interests on the other hand. And corporate interests find it very useful because here is a political formation that would actually carry through this dialectic, which is actually being played out at this moment in the country. Now, in order to be able to argue that really the crisis is because insufficient concessions have been given to the capitalists, let's give more concessions, you really then have to look at the origin of the crisis also in some such thing that happened, which actually, as it were, punctured the kind of animal spirits of the capitalists. And typically this is the way the argument was sold, that in India growth has slowed down. Why? It has slowed down because the Manmohan Singh government was an incompetent government, because it didn't take decisions. There was an absence of governance. In other words, the whole crisis was explained in terms of the flaws of a particular person or a particular government rather than any systemic phenomena. Typically, however, crises under neoliberalism are systemic phenomena because in neoliberalism, growth essentially occurs because of the formation of bubbles. And consequently, whenever there is a bubble, there is some growth. When the bubble collapses, the growth collapses. The bubble doesn't have to be in your domestic economy. In our case, the bubble was actually in the international economy, which saw a very substantial growth rate, first through the dot-com bubble in the United States and subsequently through the housing bubble in the United States. The delayed effects of the collapse of that bubble are now being felt on the Indian economy. It is a systemic crisis, and consequently, to put the blame for the systemic crisis upon the non-functioning of the Manmohan Singh government and then to use it as an occasion for increasing the class power of capital is precisely what we are observing at the present moment. Now, one very important implication of this kind of trajectory upon which the economy is currently launched is the fact that it actually decimates petty production, including peasant agriculture. Typically, of course, under capitalist conditions, there is a tendency to encroach upon the spheres of petty production in peasant agriculture. We see it everywhere. But this becomes particularly important in a situation of neoliberalism because whatever little protection that petty production and peasant agriculture got in the earlier period, state protection, for instance, the protection of handloom cloths, certain things were reserved for them. There was protection of peasant agriculture, from the international market, through subsidized credit and all the rest of it. And many of those are withdrawn, and as a result, you allow greater capacity to capital to penetrate into the spheres of petty production and peasant agriculture. Now this gets further boosted in a situation of crisis because, as I said, in such a situation, the argument is do this, otherwise the economy would continue to remain stuck in the crisis. And this is exactly what we are seeing now, for instance, with this land ordinance and so on, all of which really amounts to a way of making it possible for capital not only to encroach upon but to actually decimate peasant agriculture and petty production generally. And this is something which therefore gets a further boost. And in the current year, I believe that whatever you find occurring in the economy is actually going to be further worsened for at least two reasons. The first reason is, as I said, this decimation of peasant agriculture, in particular now that there is also a natural factor added to it in terms of unseasonal rains, would bring a further constraint as far as the demand is concerned, home market is concerned, because even such peasant incomes as used to accrue would no longer accrue in the coming year. So there would be a shrinkage of market on that count. there would be a further shrinkage of the market because something is happening internationally of which we should actually take note. And that consists in the fact that till now, whatever was our balance of payment situation was kept under control, partly because, of course, we know there was a fall in oil prices which helped the economy, and partly also because quantitative easing meant the inflow of substantial amounts of finance into the Indian economy. So there was not much of a serious problem in terms of pressure on the rupee. There was in 2013, but fairly soon that is something which was kept in check. Now with the quantitative easing now more or less being tapered off, and already the tapering off has started, and the trade deficit widening, you find already that there is a pressure on the rupee which is beginning to emerge. And this pressure is going to intensify. Inflation, which has come down, essentially because of the fall in oil prices, is something which once more is going to revive in a big way if you actually have a depreciation of the rupee, because the import costs go up and they would get passed on. And consequently, we are going to have a situation where, in order to prevent inflation or to check inflation, the government would cut back its expenditures further. Since there is the fiscal responsibility legislation, cutting back of this government expenditure would typically take the form of squeezing transfers to the poor, welfare expenditures, expenditures on, let us say, REGS and so on, which already have been cut quite drastically. So you find that there will be a further squeeze as far as petty producers, agricultural workers, industrial workers and so on are concerned. And that is something which is going to happen. Now, what is the BJP government's own, shall we say, extra thinking when it comes to this business of as I said, increase in class power of capital, starting this dialectic of capital encroaching on other classes? That's something happening everywhere. Austerity is a manifestation of this. In fact, Noam Chomsky calls austerity an intensification of class war. Now that is something which is happening everywhere. What's the BJP government's own, if you like, so-called original thinking on it? Now that thinking, as far as I can see, consists in the following: that they have discovered the virtues of the public sector. If it is the case that private investment is not responding to all these measures supposedly supposed to boost animal spirits and increase middle class power of capital, if private investment is not responsive, then one thing we can do is to actually ask public sector firms to invest more. As a matter of fact, already you can see a suggestion in the last budget, and this is being carried forward, that really let us ask the public sector to undertake larger investment, and that could be a way of getting out of the crisis. Other ways of getting out of the crisis, some people are talking about reductions in the interest rate. Reductions in the interest rate don't have much of an impact on investment anyway, and what is more, reductions in investment in the interest rate nobody is going to do when the balance of payments are now coming under increasing strain. Some others, all this Make in India, at a time when the world economy itself is in a crisis, not much investment is taking place, nobody is going to come and invest in India. So all those are really non-starters. But one of the things which the government does very seriously, I imagine, is attempting to do is to boost public sector investment by asking public sector firms to invest more. But you see that normally as a person who believes in the public sector, if a right-wing government sees virtues in the public sector, I should be getting very happy about it. As a matter of fact, what is going to happen is that this increase in public sector investment, which is not going to happen from budgetary resources, because we are going to have fiscal responsibility legislation being increasingly more binding, which is a part of the increasing class power of capital. This public sector investment, which would happen through larger borrowings in areas in which they have been asked to invest, not necessarily because demand is rising rapidly, would necessarily put many of these public sector firms in the red. When that happens, far from coming to their rescue, this very same government is likely to privatize the public sector units for a song. As a result, this is apparently a way of getting the economy out of the crisis, whether it obviously it would not do so for reasons I've been talking about. True, it will boost demand to a certain extent if there is large-scale investment, but on the other hand, we also know that there are the international factors, the domestic factors, the shift in income distribution, shrinkage in the home market, all of which are working in the direction of worsening the crisis. But on the other hand, what it would mean that while public sector investment, if it is boosted, may to some extent act as some kind of a restraint, but at the same time would provide the basis on which this government is going to privatize public sector units for a song. If they boosted public sector investment with budgetary resources, if they did so by, for instance, putting much larger orders on the public sector, in that case matters would be different. But that is not the way that they're actually planning to do it. I'll just suggest, therefore, that that the way for the economy to move forward is a way which is the very opposite of what the current government is planning to do. And that way consists in really expanding the size of the domestic market. And this expansion in size of the domestic market can occur only through a transfer of incomes towards the working population. For instance, MGNREGS was one way of doing it. I believe that actually there should be a substantial number of economic rights which should be introduced as far as every citizen is concerned, like right to food, right to employment, right to old age pensions and disability benefits, right to free publicly funded health care through the National Health Service, through a National Health Service, and the right to free and quality education from public institutions, at least up to a certain level. I believe these should be legislated and they should be used to expand the constitutional Bill of Rights which accrues to every citizen. The idea, in my view, therefore, to get out of the current crisis is to essay a shift in income distribution in favor of the working population. But what is actually happening now is the very opposite, and that, I am going to say, is not going to worsen the crisis, but will have very serious political consequences in terms of possible shifts towards authoritarianism and fascism, which I imagine subsequent sessions will be discussing. Thank you very much.
May I now invite Professor Atul Sood.
Thank you, Professor Nayyar, and Shabnam and other friends for asking me to come and speak here today. I completely agree with what Professor Prabhat Patnaik has said in terms of what is behind the existing crisis and how the capital is trying to address this crisis in India. What I'm going to spend time on is to sort of pick some examples and show what has been done in the last 1 year and how do we go ahead from here in terms of the lessons that we can learn based on the experience of the last 1 year. In fact, it's interesting that we had met at the Idea of India conclave in July 2014. And when we had met, we had made an assessment of the challenges that we would face after the 2014 elections and how India is going to change and what we are going to experience in the coming years and months. And I must confess, very sadly though, that whatever we had expected and feared in July 2014 has pretty much proven to be true. In fact, when we had discussed the economy in July 2014, where both Professor Nayyar and Professor Patnaik were there, we had talked about at least 3 core areas in which we had expected that fundamental changes would be brought in, and this was land, labor, and the set of regulations. These were the 3 core areas we had expected that major changes in policy would occur. What the government has done, if you look at the last 1 year, some people have been arguing that it's too short a period to make an assessment of the economic performance of any government, which I would say is fair. But if you look at the direction, the trajectory in which the changes have been introduced, I would fairly confidently say that one of the fundamental shifts that has happened in the last 1 year is that the present regime is trying to, in a way, move away from the mandate that Indian constitution makers had laid down for the Indian nation. One of the core tasks that the constitution had laid down on any governments and regimes that came to power in this country was to protect the weak against the strong. This was a mandate which was reflected not only in the directive principles, but in other places in the constitution as well. And if you look at the actions and the initiatives and the programs and policies that the state has initiated in the last 1 year, one can find umpteen number of examples where these, instead of protecting the weak against the strong, the policies that the state have made, and as Professor Patnaik explained, is to strengthen and further strengthen the power, the energies, and the range and the access to resources of the strong or of the rich. We know that this is not new. I mean, in the 1990s, and in fact even before that, we know that the state had, the idea had dawned on the state that it was the corporations which are going to be, in the forefront in terms of putting countries on global horizon. So it's not the BJP regime that has come and started doing it. But what is interesting or what is significant to note is that the manner in which the existing regime has brought forward this process, particularly in areas where the previous regimes were a bit reluctant to intervene, for all kinds of reasons, particularly in terms of recognition of the fact of the complexity, diversity, and the political challenges that this country experiences. The current regime has both the mandate, it thought it had the mandate, and also its dependence on the ideological instruments that it has access to, but including its willingness to use authoritarian instruments and oppression in order to sustain this direct intervention on behalf of the corporates. I think is a distinct change from the previous regimes which had initiated a process of economic reform. It is interesting to note that the Prime Minister of the country has been visiting country after country, basically to ensure, or basically to represent India's idea, or idea of India, where India represents a location or a place which is easy for doing business. So it's quite interesting that the whole national identity of this country in many ways has reduced to establishing the significance and the usefulness and the efforts that are being made in this country in terms of the government policy and regimes of how this is a destination which is easy for doing business. Now, so creating an enabling environment for transacting business has become our new national identity. So we had moved from human rights to procedural rights. We had moved from looking to be worried about really the last person that Gandhi talked about to be worrying about in some ways Nehru's Birla since independence. But this is a new phenomenon where the whole national identity and the USP of the nation, so to say, is got reduced to being a center which is very friendly to investors and is willing to do anything for the investors and to come to this country. We were told domestically, when the Prime Minister has been going to different parts of the world, we were told domestically that let's start with trust. And I'm not sure if you noticed, the Prime Minister repeatedly uses the word trust whenever he talks about labour reforms. It's quite interesting. So the trust is essentially in terms of bringing about or lauding labour reforms, essentially again, as Professor Patnaik explained and all of you are aware, in order for companies to do business in India. So India, in some ways, and therefore I'm saying that India's national pride and India's arrival on the international stage is now tied to labour reforms in an indirect manner. And of course, this has never happened before. And of course, the national project also now wants to not only revamp the labour laws. There's already talk about lots have already been done in terms of environmental, land acquisition, and all resource-related laws. So there's a new definition of governance, and the new definition of governance is that law and order are to be maintained such that maximum exploitation of natural resources can be permitted. This is a distinct shift from the past without recognizing any other needs of the Indian citizens, of the Indian working class, and the average Indian people. It's only when you give up this pretense of doing things on behalf of the poor, on behalf of the average Indian citizen, that you can start to think about tweaking everything. I was trying to list the laws that last 1 year are being tweaked, or already there's a discussion, and I couldn't complete the list, but I'm just going to quickly read. I mean, just imagine in 1 year the kind of provisions that we are trying to tinker with. The Workmen Compensation Act, the Trade Union Act, the Payment of Wages Act, the Employment of Children Act, the Factories Act, the Employment State Insurance Act, Plantation Labour Act, Mine Act, Employment Provident Fund and Miscellaneous Provision Act, Payment of Bonus Act, Payment of Gratuity Act, Bonded Labour Act, Contract Labour Act, Interstate Workmen Conditions of Service Act, Child Labour Act, Factories Act, land acquisition bill, and of course, and so on and so forth. And if you'll notice, there's an underlying thread, there's one thing common. Most of these laws and provisions deal with the labor, the working class. So the core issue really is of altering the conditions for capital such that it could exploit the labor and get access to natural resources more and more. It's also an interesting time in some ways that it's not only about changing the discourse about what the Indian nation stands for. We are being also introduced to some new interesting terms and concepts. Tax terrorism, hardships of doing business. Now, I had heard of hardships of living, hardships of not getting 2 square meals, but hardships of doing business. There's also this talk about tax terrorism. So there's lots of learning for us to do. I think 1 year is just too short period for us. We are going to be introduced with newer and newer provisions, newer and newer concepts that we will have to deal with, which will of course be in the spirit of such that will further strengthen the reach of capital in terms of, as I said, for 2 things, in terms of exploiting and accessing more and more surplus from labor, and also getting and exploiting greater and greater volumes of natural resources. I was looking at the draft code bill of the Wage Bill 2015. It is an interesting concept. It proposes to change the term inspector to facilitator. And this is, of course, no mean change, it's a very significant change. So the facilitator, in other words, the inspector, in other words, the regulator, is going to be the agent who's going to record to supply information and advice to employers and workers concerning the most effective means of complying with provisions of the code. So the regulator and the inspector is not going to be the one who's going to penalize if you don't follow the law. He's going to be the facilitator who will help you implement the law to the best that you can implement. The 2014 bill of the Factories Act of 1948 again introduces the idea of compounding in the section 92.c of the Act. And it's very interesting that if you make the following offences, they can all be compounded. These are non-provision of drinking water for workers, facilities for sitting, allowing double employment, not maintaining registers, not paying wages due to workers. So there are 32 offences that you can do as a company, and they can all be compounded. And once they are compounded, you might either be asked to give a small penalty, or once that penalty is addressed in whatever manner it is addressed, then you will no longer be held guilty for having committed that crime. So not implementing the law is literally not an offence, as the new provisions are being introduced all over. The third concept, the third sort of new area where we've been recently introduced is this concept of cooperative federalism. We have very senior economists here, social thinkers here, and I'd be very happy to get an idea of what this cooperative federalism is, because literally no one knows what it means. The government of India has in the last 1 year dismantled the planning commission without telling us what it is going to be replaced with. So it's an interesting way in which the state is reached a point where it can dismantle what has been done in the past without really answering questions of what it is going to do in the future. This is a remarkable situation which has not happened and not been done by any elected regime in the past, since independence. Without explaining to us what it will do, it's replace something. Of course, we had issues with the planning commission. I mean, anyone in this hall, if I were to ask to raise hands or what their questions were or what their, how they were unhappy with the planning commission, we would have a list. But what it is going to be replaced with, without knowing that we have dismantled the institution, has serious implications. What cooperative federalism means, I can only figure out from what all is being done by the states, not really by what the 14th Finance Commission tells us, labour reforms and land reforms, which for political reasons, given the configuration of the Rajya Sabha, may not go as smoothly as the government would have expected or wanted it to go. If you look at what the states are doing, I was looking at Gujarat. Now Gujarat has done a very interesting thing. It has proposed to make place for what it calls self-certification consolidated annual return scheme. So for companies, it is introducing an idea of self-certification consolidated annual return scheme, which will also get extended to all the provisions of the Factories Act. So basically, the companies will self-certify whether they are paying minimum wages, whether they are paying bonus, whether they are paying gratuity, whether all the matters that are related to contract labor will be now all self-certified. There'll be no regular audits of these companies, and randomly a few companies will be selected, and if their self-certification is proven to be wrong, then necessary action will be taken. In fact, those companies which implement the labor laws and the labor standards will be awarded appreciation certificates, says the Gujarat government. So no longer honoring the law is a requirement. It's a matter of getting an appreciation certificate if you honor the law. Again, this is a shift in terms of how things have been moving in the last 1 year. If you look at the Rajasthan Amendment Bill on the Companies Act, once again, there is this provision of compounding. And even if any offence is committed under the framework of compounding, so if you make those errors and if all the non-implementation of these regulatory provisions are put together, are compounded, it's no longer a crime. You need not be taken to the court. And if you have to be taken to the court, it requires a written sanction by the state government. So essentially, implementation of the law of the land requires a written sanction by the state government. This is what the Rajasthan government is doing. Madhya Pradesh government is also doing another interesting thing. It wants to outcompete Rajasthan. So in September 2014, it has given approval to 20 labor laws that need to be amended. The Labour Commissioner has announced that layoffs, retrenchments and even closures will not require any permission. Hire and fire, of course, there's also interesting talk about taking care of women. This provision in the Factories Act saying that no women shall be required to allowed to work in a factory except between hours 6 a.m. and 7 p.m. Now this is being amended, and I need to quickly read through it what they are proposing. It's saying that provided where the state government or any person authorized by it in this behalf is satisfied that adequate safeguards exist in a factory as regards occupational safety, provision of shelter, sexual harassment, and the rest. Then the factory is entitled to employ women even under those hours. So essentially, the interpretation of the government is the basis of implementing the law of the land. Both in my examples of what Madhya Pradesh is, what is being proposed in terms of when women can be employed. So all you need is a certificate saying that the government is satisfied that the women are safe. And the government, of course, is mostly satisfied when these matters are concerned. So then the women will be asked to work even at late hours. No other evaluation of the factory would be done. No other regulatory check of the factory would be done except by a general certificate by the government. So, interesting interpretation also been given to policy paralysis in the last 1 year. I'm just quickly going to the point that I wanted to make. There's a lot of talk about policy paralysis in the previous regime and in the previous elections. Smart cities is one way to respond to policy paralysis. Clearly, that's what the government says. So, on matters like forest rights, food security, environment protection, labor welfare, a lot of achievements were done in the previous regimes, though all of them reflect policy paralysis as the election discourse was and the post-election events have unfolded. And what we now need is that, in some ways, the way to defeat defeatism and way to overcome policy paralysis is to introduce measures like smart cities, where lots is available of what smart cities are. This is once again an area in which government has not come up with any written policy framework of what it means by smart cities, how they are going to be constructed, what are the regulatory norms that are going to be implemented, even though the idea might be as absurd as buying a land next to an existing city and creating an artificial city and the problems and challenges it poses. But even to the extent that you want to do that, there is no details shared with us. Once again, a policy has been introduced, and the policy apparatus is being geared to bring investment for smart cities. The whole visit to Canada and so on was around those interests, but none of the details have been shared with us. In the first 50 days of this government's coming to power, the extent to which clearances were given to projects was a response to the whole argument of policy paralysis. And I will just 2-3 minutes. And if you look at the examples where these clearances were given, infrastructure projects. If I just quickly name, so these are Adani's projects in Mundra, Coal India Limited's projects in Assam, Reliance Power projects in Madhya Pradesh, Gales Power gas-based plant in Madhya Pradesh, state highway projects in Assam, and so on and so forth. Most areas where the access to natural resources is an issue, environmental clearances have been given to these pending projects without doing due diligence. A lot of other initiatives have been done in the last 1 year. I don't want to give all the examples. Let me just make my last point, that given the changes that this government is bringing, a gathering like us, how do we address this and what are the lessons we learn? My sense is that if you look at the initiatives that the present regime has initiated, interestingly, many of the initiatives that I have listed have run into trouble. And they've run into trouble because of the Indian people. Because of the protest and the struggle of the Indian people who have the capacity to oppose it. So if you look at the success that this government can share with the world, the success are nothing but continuation of the programs that were being implemented by the previous regimes. All those initiatives that this new regime has brought in the last 1 year have not really reached any conclusion. One of the explanations that will be given in a short time from now when the government comes up with the report card is that this is too short a time period for it to achieve its goals. My sense is it reflects the strength and the capacity of the struggling people of this, the working class of this country, the peasants and the other political and social movements who have resisted it in their own way. And this government's lack of capacity to recognize the political challenges and the complexity of this country, which I think gives me hope of bringing the downfall of a regime like this, and therefore giving us an opportunity to at least construct a world which is better for at least the average citizen and the poor people in this country. Thank you.
We have had two lucid and persuasive presentations. Prabhat argued that income distribution lies at the heart of the crisis in the economy, and that this crisis is not conjunctural, but it is systemic. And while the BJP government has a pro-market view, certainly in terms of checks and balances, that suggests a pro-people sentiment. Let me with this bring the session to a close.